The first time I heard of Thomas Wolfe, I had a sense of foreboding. I, who loved the man, say this. But then every good thing that comes is accompanied by trouble. Before I met Tom, I saw his book, which was huge and unruly, and his agent told me that he'd been beaten almost to death in a fight at the Oktoberfest in Munich. I was afraid that I would have to restrain two Moby Dicks at once, the man and the book. But on that day when I looked up and saw him standing in the doorway of my box stall of an office, leaning against the door jamb, hesitating to enter, when I saw his wild black hair and bright countenance, although he was so altogether different physically, I thought right away of Shelley. He was fair, but his hair was wild, and his face was bright, and his head disproportionately small, just like Tom's. Tom was very nervous and excited that day. I asked him a few questions about the characters in his book. That was before he had begun to call it Look Homeward, Angel. Then I mentioned the scene where Elizabeth, the madam, buys the marble angel from W.O. Grant and has it erected as a tombstone for one of her girls. Tom burst out, "I know you can't print that. I'll take it out at once, Mr. Perkins." I had to reassure him by telling him that I had read it to Hemingway the week before, and that I thought it was one of the greatest short stories I had ever read, all of which was the truth. When I told him I was sure Scribner's magazine would take it, he seemed depressed. He said later that he thought that little bit was all we wanted of the book. Then I started on the book. I had made a lot of notes, and I began to suggest some revisions and rearrangements of scenes, Tom wildly offering to throw out everything I mentioned. He said he was so touched to think that at last someone had thought enough of his work to sweat over it this way. I told him that everyone in the place had read it. After several days, Tom got to work. Once or twice a week, he would come in with about 100 pages, and we would go over them together. He worked all day, every day in January, February, and March, and at the end of it, of all that work and time, the book was only shorter by 8 pages. He would stare for hours at the manuscript before cutting out a few sentences. He never knew where to cut. He would begin to reread a section to find things to omit, and he would invariably be reminded of other things he could or should have said, and he would begin enthusiastically to write in long additions. I saw that I must step in or the job would never get done. After that, we met at Scribner's in the evening when everyone else had gone home. We moved large blocks of writing from one place in the manuscript to another, but for the most part, we cut. I would suggest leaving something out, and then we would discuss it and fight over it, and then Tom would agree to let it go. I didn't forget that it was Tom's. An editor should add nothing to a book. He should release energy but create nothing. I believe in that. I tried to see the form that was there in Tom's book and to help him see it, and I think I did. It was there. It ran through everything. It was the story of the boy Eugene and his wild and strange family as seen through Eugene's eyes, from the time when he could first see and know anything until he left home, until he left the South. Tom wrote almost those words himself in a note which he sent with the manuscript, and which I read before I read anything else he had written. During that spring and early summer, when we were working together on Look Homeward, Angel, we spent a lot of evenings together walking around the city. Tom seemed to inhale everything, all the sights, sounds, and smells of an entire city block, all at once. He was like Swift or Stephen Crane. He was a keen observer. He frequented saloons and drank there, and knew 100 bartenders as friends. But it was not because of the drink. He loved the live, expressive talk of natural people at a bar where their tongues are loosened a little or much, and they speak in the language of life. Sometimes on those walks, Tom would talk about what he was going to write next. He always knew what he wanted to say, but he was sometimes confused about how to go about saying it, the shape of it, the form of it. Sometimes, when he was silent, I would make up ideas for books, just stories that didn't amount to anything, just maundering until something caught his attention. Once I said that I had always thought a grand story could be written about a boy who had never seen his father having left when he was a baby, or even before that, as a soldier of fortune, say, and of how this boy set out to find his father and went through a series of adventures, a picaresque kind of novel. I said this idly, for of course such a story as I was thinking of could only be written by one of those fairy tale writers that we all publish. But Tom ruminated on that as if it were a serious matter, and after a while he said, "I think I could use that, Max." I was puzzled because my idea was merely a superficial story of adventure far below Tom's talents. I was even a little worried that he should consider it, until I realized that the underlying truth of the idea was what he was thinking of. He was taking the search for a father in a very profound sense, and in fact, that was exactly what he wrote about next. Max was full of ideas. He thought honey ought to be sold in tubes like toothpaste. They could be called tubes of liquid sunshine. He always refused to dim his headlights because he thought it was silly. When he walked, he would throw a stone from hand to hand so that the upper part of his body would get exercise also. He suggested to Winston Churchill that he, Churchill, write a history of the British Empire. That was what later became a history of the English-speaking peoples. When you give someone else an idea, you can't tell what will happen to it. Max was very generous that way. Maybe he liked sending his ideas out into the world and watching them develop in ways that he couldn't have predicted. He gave Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings the idea of writing a book about a boy who lived in the scrub. He thought of it as an adventure book for boys about outdoor life. She thought about Max's idea, put it aside, wrote another book, and came back to it several years later and wrote The Yearling. Max's idea was there, but changed into something he couldn't have foreseen. He told her years later that he remembered how many anxious nights. It was published the spring before Tom Wolfe got so sick, when he had already broken away from Max. Anyway, Max said he remembered how many anxious nights he got through happily by just thinking of The Yearling. But many things, both happy and sad, happened in Max's life before that.